Hi everyone, thanks for connecting. Welcome to another webinar organized by C&C. I'm João Quirapinha. We arrange a webinar series, Leaders in Market Access, to share skills and experiences in market access, what work is like in this field, and the future of market access. As always, it's a pleasure to introduce our next leader in market access. Reg Waldeck is Vice President, Access, Pricing, and Health Economics at Celldex Therapeutics in New York. Reg has held various positions on market access, pricing, marketing, reimbursement, and health economics, starting out at Bristol Myers Squibb in Australia. Reg, thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning, and pleasure to be here.
So how did your career get started in market access?
Well, I actually started with one of the bigger pharma companies at Bristol Myers Squibb in around the late 90s, in coming into a department called Health Economics. And as many of you will know, Australia was one of the first countries to formally adopt health economics and cost-effectiveness criteria for its pricing and reimbursement at the national level. So I spent 3 years there, which was really good training from two aspects. One, I ended up, learning how to put pricing and reimbursement submissions together according to pharmaceutical guidelines, negotiate pricing with the national government, and also importantly, some of the technical details in terms of putting health economic models together.
Okay. That's fantastic. And then based on that experience that you had initially at Bristol Myers Squibb, did you feel that there were certain educational skills or educational preparation that you thought was essential for you to be able to do those health economic submissions and the technical work?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. I think in terms of the capabilities and competencies, that are valuable in this area, it's worth spending a minute or so on that. My entry into the industry was, for me, but I think this can be quite varied through more of a science background. I do have a higher degree in science and in biochemistry, and the other component that helped me a lot was more of the math and the mathematical modeling that I've done prior to coming into the industry, which supported some of taking on the health economics modeling very early on. That said, I think a varied background is just fine. I think these days, you tend to have to cover a lot of areas. You tend to have to interface with a lot of different disciplines. And so anything from, health economics training to health policy, to more of a commercial background, finance even, I think are all areas that, would stand you in good stead. So I would say what you come in with, perhaps a little bit less important. What I think is more important is that you do have an ability to cover, a fair few of those areas up to a certain point, of course, because you can certainly specialize over time a little bit in the more technical area, or if you are inclined that way more on the commercial side or the health policy side. But I think those types of backgrounds are all good in terms of entering the industry.
Right, got you. And so in terms of having that science, that mathematical modeling background that you mentioned, either health economics or health policy, are there specific qualifications that you think are a good sort of entry point, and then building on that entry point, as you mentioned, with kind of on the job training and on the job experience, and accumulating that over a period of time?
Yeah, and I suppose there are. I think it does matter, though, ultimately, sort of what track, even within, this area of market access and health economics, you want to go towards. I do think if you want to be a true health economist and want to produce health economic models and cost effectiveness analyses and cost utility analyses, then you absolutely should, I would argue, even have a higher degree in that field. and the kinds of technical ability, if you like, to support that track. That is not something perhaps that if you're not necessarily that way inclined, that is readily learned on the job. So I would say that. That said, these days, right, there are other areas within market access, more on the policy side, the negotiating side, that require other skills, and if you don't quite have the very high analytical prowess, so to speak, I think there's plenty of room for people like that as well.
Okay, got it. So the higher degree, by that you would mean master's degrees, for instance, any postgraduate work, or even potentially a PhD in the future, right?
Yeah, no. Again, I think particularly for the technical fields, yes, I would say yes. That's my background too. I do have a PhD, and it does help absolutely. I think on the technical side, I don't want to. I suppose what I'm trying to get across is that the field is so varied these days that I wouldn't want to discourage anybody who doesn't have that kind of background and is more interested perhaps in sort of the business side, the negotiation side. I think there are tracks for that as well, and I think therefore a varied background is just fine. I do think you then want to be a little deliberative and realistic about the kind of track that you would pursue even within market access.
Okay, all right, got it. So in terms of what work is like in your career at the moment on a day-to-day basis, given all the experience that you've had, Bristol Myers Squibb, Celldex more recently, what are the skills that you apply on a day-to-day basis in your career?
Yeah, so I think they're a mix of the analytical and also obviously business acumen, if you like. I would say, given the importance of market access and the pricing and value debate these days, it's very much at the forefront in what I would argue most companies, if not all companies. And with that also, you need to draw upon trying to influence and be convincing to a fairly large set of stakeholders that range all the way from R&D in terms of optimizing trial design for access to commercial colleagues who have P&L responsibility and for whom a pricing decision can be a very important one. And so I think that piece of it in terms of making sure that you can manage through influencing and is very, very key these days and is becoming more key. And then the last piece, depending on, again, a little bit on your role, I would also argue that, negotiating is an important skill to learn, to have, even in a global role. I would argue that local experience in a market, having negotiated at some form, could be hospital tendering, could be regional, could be at the national level, I think also would stand somebody in good stead for two reasons. One is, business, at the end of the day, business is negotiating. And secondly, it allows you to connect, I think, with your local colleagues, perhaps in a slightly better way. Don't want to necessarily say been there, done that, but then again, if you can also draw upon a local market experience, which typically gives you that negotiating experience, I think that is definitely a plus.
Have you found that the negotiating skills that you just mentioned is useful in the external stakeholder environment, but is it also useful in the internal environment within the organization, and that is negotiating with either subsidiaries of the headquarters or alternatively with other functional areas within the organization?
Yeah, right. I mean, to some extent, we're all negotiating every day about smaller or larger decisions. So I think that the quick answer to that, Joao, is definitely yes. I think what negotiating teaches you is to spend most of your time thinking about what the other side values and what's
Okay.
important to the other side. And I think that clearly internally also is key. And, maybe just to give a quick example, a local market general manager will think about certain decisions quite differently than someone sitting in global regulatory or global research. Yet, at some level, market access has to bridge a lot of these different viewpoints.
Right.
And so, I would say that skill or that experience can also help internally.
So, and what would you find most challenging in your current role?
Yeah, so I think maybe there are a few things. The plethora, the multitude of issues in what you might broadly call the price-value debate is really, quite astounding. And so one of the things that I spend a lot of my time on is to see the forest through the trees.
Okay.
There's a lot of stuff that is happening both in the U.S. and Europe. And I think the work then, needs to focus on which of these trends, which of these initiatives are actually of most importance to your particular portfolio. And that takes some time, and that is fundamental to strategy, right? Which is deciding what you want to focus on, but sometimes even more importantly, what you don't want to focus on. I spend time on that. That can absolutely be challenging because there's a lot going on. I think the other piece that frankly makes market access so attractive these days and interesting is just the proliferation of the stakeholder set that you're dealing with.
Okay.
And maybe to illustrate this without going into great detail, the whole communication process around value and pricing, even 5 to 10 years ago, I would argue, although advanced, let's say, to the payer audience, was much less advanced to other stakeholders, such as physicians, the media, advocacy, etc. And clearly, over the last, you can argue, let's call it about 5 years or less, those stakeholders have a real, not only stake, they always had a stake, but a real voice in that debate. And you need to think actively about that and continue to be consistent, obviously, in the point that you want to, yet be adaptive enough.
This price value debate that you mentioned and the increased complexity over the past couple of years, and also the multitude of stakeholders that kind of also complicates the process of communicating those value arguments. It seems to be quite a complex field, but what excites you the most in doing all of this? Just given the growth in complexity, the growth in also just the sheer high risk environment of this price value debate.
Yeah, I think they're big challenges. They're big challenges for health systems at large, and so I think I think what's exciting about that is that you do have to think of as an industry professional very much at the product level. And truly understand, how you want to communicate value for a particular product in the best way, like we said, to these various audiences, which takes work. I think what is interesting these days is that, we're even within industry, we should all be active in that debate around the health system as well, and that can go as far as true macro level. Policy changes both at the government level as well as the private level in the U.S. between private insurance companies or CMS, etc. And I think industry does have a role to play in terms of being part of that debate, and in some cases where it's appropriate, even shaping that debate. And so I think that's terribly interesting, because we get to, if you like, obviously support the company, but I think as an industry, we also, we need to be active within that debate, and we have something to say about that, and I think our input in that debate is also very valuable.
Are there things in the field of market access that you think could be done better, just generally speaking, or specifically around your role?
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously, potentially multiple answers to that. Let me pick one. One other thing that, I spend some time on thinking about is efficiencies.
Yep.
So I believe that, the model, the organizational model with which we execute on access and pricing and health technology assessment around the world is also one worth thinking about. If you just add up, if you like, the various HTA requirements and dossier requirements and frankly access requirements, even in the U.S., across having to negotiate with multiple individual payers, I think there are interesting ways you can think about the deployment of how you execute on market access. And without, again, perhaps going into great detail, I think one option that I think about is, what's the right balance between strategic outsourcing, if you like, and having people in-house and flexing resources over time with regards to launches. These are all things that I also think about, and frankly are also exciting, because it's another challenge that you can try to find new models for.
Got it. So looking up ahead into the future and the future of market access, specifically in the pharmaceutical industry, do you see enough growth happening in this area of market access to be able to accommodate others coming into this field? And if so, are there specific subset of skills that you think there's greater demand for?
Yeah, so I think I would say that there is quite a demand for professionals in market access and let's say just all the related fields, right? So health technology assessment, formal modeling, negotiating, pricing, health policy, epidemiology. I think all those areas are important and related. So I think if you're coming from any of these backgrounds, I think market access is a real option. I also wouldn't want to discourage my more business-minded colleagues. I spent 6 years of my life also in marketing at the global and operational level. And I think these days, with market access being so important to, if you like, the commercial thinking in terms of selecting business opportunities, etc., how you define the market, how you ultimately support positioning by way of your value story. All of these things are becoming very important as well, and I think take a greater role. So I would say there are a number of disciplines that you can come in with. What I would say, as I said earlier, is maximize the training that you do have. And perhaps the only caution that I would give is, if you're truly interested in executing on more of the technical side of the business, then you should absolutely have training in that, because to some extent, obviously, let's say a PhD in health economics or modeling cannot be learned on the job.
Right, absolutely. So, again, looking up ahead in the future and developments in the horizon, do you see any major changes that would impact the industry, which would impact the role and the type of skills and expertise needed in the field of market access. Well, one point that you've already mentioned in the conversation is a price value debate, and it seems that that requires kind of an interdisciplinary approach, right? But are there other events, other potential activities in the future that may shape or change the role of market access?
Yeah, I think there are a number of trends. So one that comes to mind for me immediately is the desire to also on the regulatory side to be more efficient and faster with bringing products to market.
Okay.
I see that is a very helpful and I would even say hopeful trend, but it needs to be balanced, right, with that risk-benefit mindset. That said, particularly in Europe, but the U.S. certainly is also, continuing to think about that and try to find ways to bring products to market faster. I think is a very, very big trend, which will shift us more from a sort of stage gate mentality, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, into more of a fluid, continuous development process, right, with conditional approval, conditional reimbursement. And then what we see, a little bit more advanced perhaps in Europe with these accelerated access schemes that then also require post-marketing studies to be done, not only for pharmacovigilance, but also for outcomes and understanding the real-world impact of a compound. I think those are very important trends. They obviously are not new today, but they are also not mature. They will continue to develop. And I think keeping abreast of that, ensuring that you have the capabilities to deal with that, which is very much on sort of the real-world data side as well. We see that enter into regulatory submissions and discussions even. I think that's one very key trend. And the other one is the price value debate, right? What is good value? How do we define value? As a quick example, in oncology, a number of institutions have come up with these oncology value frameworks. Some of them approach them from the individual patient standpoint. Others approach them from the health system standpoint or societal standpoint. Trying to bridge these various perspectives and be able to nimbly move between them, I think is another trend and again, perhaps even skill that you would want to develop.
Got it. So these would be the mega trends that you see impacting the industry, the improved efficiency in bringing products to market, accelerated approval, price value debate. Do you also see it unfolding on a regional basis? So Europe and North America are kind of share some similarities, but they are also distinctively different. Do you see any regional differences or regional trends that may impact the future of market access?
Yeah, so I suppose my viewpoint on that, Joao, is perhaps a little bit unique, and it comes back to sort of having grown up in the Australian system. And I look at the world more as the future is already here. It just hasn't diffused across the world yet. And so the way I would approach that question is a little more from, are there regional differences? Yeah, sure, there are. Clearly, the U.S. system works very differently than that in Europe and other geographies. But perhaps what is not so different is that, payers, other entities are looking to each other to find, mechanisms that would make most sense for them. And so I come at that question a little bit more from the viewpoint that perhaps nothing is truly new, and that's going a little bit far. Of course, there will be new trends and new initiatives. But it's more about the diffusion of knowledge that can take place. Even very concrete, like reference pricing, for instance. Maybe some of your readership wouldn't know this, but the Australian system had class reference pricing in the late 90s and early 2000s in a very, very,
Okay.
arguably sophisticated way. I was
Yeah.
part of developing statistical methodology or ensuring that it was a fair statistical methodology, if you like. Years ahead, years before Germany was thinking about class reference pricing. And so I feel that things are not necessarily new. They need to diffuse, and that I think is what we see happening most. That said, perhaps one last thought on this. I do think in the price value debate, maybe the next frontier is more around financing. So we've come a long way already, I believe, with value-based outcomes agreements and contracting, and again, some ways to go, but a lot of thought has been put into that, and I think we'll get there. I think the next area for true exploration might be more on the financing area, on the pure financing arena. Might there be other financing approaches in the healthcare system, that can ultimately create value across multiple stakeholders?
Yeah.
That is still a very open question, one that has not necessarily been answered in a, let's say, more sophisticated way. I think problems have been identified, solutions have yet to be found.
Got it. Those are very useful thoughts. I love in particular what you said. The future is already here. It just hasn't yet diffused throughout the world. And this whole point of diffusion of knowledge is so critically important. As you mentioned, it kind of suggests that we don't really need to reinvent the wheel. All we need to do is just have better conversations with colleagues around the world, learn from what they've done, identify best practices, and kind of execute the same idea, maybe in a customized way. Would that be kind of a fair observation on what you mentioned?
Yeah, I might liken that to the concept of incremental versus disruptive innovation.
Okay.
In some ways, right? In some ways, incremental innovation, which can be building on others' ideas, can be, frankly, in the end, just as disruptive or valuable as true disruptive innovation. So I think we need to think about both. And perhaps, again, this is my personal opinion, I think there's a lot to be done on incremental innovation and see how various approaches can work across markets and sort of, pick what's good about it and make it better. I would say there is perhaps some true disruptive innovation to happen, on how we might ultimately finance entire health systems.
Got it. Okay, got it. I think that's a great place to end it, Reg. I want to thank you very much for sharing your insightful thoughts and the conversation on market access and your career. Keep up the great work, and thanks so much again for sharing your thoughts.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for connecting again. If you'd like to be notified of future webinars, please be sure to subscribe to our newsletter on www.carapin.com or call us directly at any of our numbers.